Our first speaker today is Andrew Sterling. I only realised yesterday I actually met Andrew in a wet field on the Isle of Arran about 3 years ago. We saw how TV Whitespace had connected a very, very remote area and learnt about the Digital Blacksmith project. Andrew has worked with all the big players in the industry, so BBC, Microsoft, BT, Sky, Nokia, etc. His talk is titled Digital Literacy. Over to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Just a small update that's actually connectivity literacy, but it's a subset of digital literacy. So we'll go with that. So it's a pleasure to be here to give you this talk as part of your Smart Towns series. First, a few words about Larkhill, which was the company I founded about 15 years ago. We're focused on digital communications and connectivity and helping companies get innovations to market. Quite a lot of what we've done has been around latest and greatest in communications technologies. But over the last decade or so, particularly working with Microsoft, we've focused on some of the challenges of how you actually get connectivity to the edges, to rural areas, to towns, to places that haven't always had the greatest broadband in the past. And one of the things we did was lead the Cambridge White Spaces trial for Microsoft, which was a major landmark in getting the necessary regulation for access to key spectrum to help broadband in areas that are not well served so far. We've interfaced with regulators on a range of topics, and particularly to enable better spectrum access to internet. We've been on the Glasgow's Future City Demonstrator Advisory Board, and we've been doing some particular work in rural communities, especially the Isle of Arran, but also linking across with Africa and the US, just to name a couple of other markets. So to launch in, communities are built around connectivity. So I see this ecosystem of people. Of course, it's all about the people. People are the central focus. But increasingly, there's a thing called data, which we need to use to function really in our modern lives. And the data can tell us about systems, can tell us about climate, it can tell us what's happening on the farm. And we have tools such as sensors that allow us to gather some of that data automatically. Of course, traditionally data got compiled from people poring over forms and typing data in, and a manual entry process, if you like. But increasingly, we see that data coming in automatically and feeding through into processing on the cloud and also now in the edge, whereas the cloud tends to be massive data centers. The edge is a lot closer to where you are and perhaps where the data needs to be handled in particular applications. And two types of connectivity we should be mentioning. One is broadband, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and the various flavors that you get. But also we need to think about narrowband, which I've put close to where the sensors are, because typically something like a temperature sensor or maybe even an air quality sensor isn't going to produce a lot of data. It's not going to really need broadband, but it needs a simple, reliable and broad coverage system, type of which we call narrowband. And you might see examples such as LoRa, NB-IoT, narrowband IoT. There are a number of these acronyms floating around, and we won't spend the time going through those. But how good does connectivity need to be? I'm going to focus in on the broadband requirements because I think that's been the main push for smart communities. And this is probably the one that comes in first. So we started off with 25 megabits per second being the target about 10 years ago, moving through 100 megabits per second, and now a gigabit per second is really where you want to be heading if you're not already there. Not a very large percentage of people have gigabit yet, but increasing numbers are at least getting some sort of option to get to it. And in thinking about the connectivity, we need to look at the application, what sorts of application we will want to be serving to drive that demand. And actually, if it's a smart town, then really we want to be able to serve the lot because we're trying to attract new industry, we're trying to retain our existing talent, enable them to work from home, from their office in town if they have one, or from the farm or wherever it is they do the work. And so, yes, I mean, you could think about what type of industries you'd like to attract. If it's film production, video production, then you better be budgeting for greater than the gigabit connectivity. That would probably be the starting point for you. And also we need to think about how to support our increasingly hybrid world. We've all seen the need to shift online with responses to lockdown in order to keep doing something productive. And even when the lockdown ceases and we become a little bit more free, a lot of people seem to agree that we'll be increasingly hybrid in the way we live our lives, whether it's working, shopping, banking, whatever we need to do. All of those services will be online and we could access them anywhere we get good online performance. Parameters such as latency, which means response time. If I do something, how quickly do I see its effect in terms of my online service? And also, how quickly do images go up to the cloud when I've got some stills to share or some video clips that I want to share with people? How quickly can they get to be seen? So those parameters have traditionally been left out of broadband specifications, at least the marketing materials for them, but they're important questions for users, and particularly if we're thinking about smart town provisioning, we need to be sure that the infrastructure is really up to the job. I did mention IoT connectivity a little bit earlier, but we won't have time to go into the details, sadly, today. So to understand the connectivity gap in terms of your smart town, I would say survey your location. You need to understand the challenges of your location, what the gap is compared with what you need. We've talked about the benchmarks, what you might be wanting to get to, but where are you today? Where are the points where optical fiber can be accessed? Those are really key. Where are the homes and businesses reporting problems, if there are any? I mean, that suggests that already today's performance isn't quite meeting people's requirements, as well as us needing to think about the roadmap for where we need to be for the problems that they're going to report in 5 years' time. So we can do technical surveys, and obviously we can do consumer surveys. Consumer surveys have the advantage of potentially being a lot cheaper and less intrusive, so we can do them during COVID restricted times. And connectivity starts with the optical fiber because we can't really do better than the fiber is able to provide. And of course, we'd love the fiber to come as close as possible to our homes and businesses, but we can't have it immediately in all cases. So we'd want it to come to at least a central hub somewhere within a community, business park, wherever it is. It might even come to individual premises. We could use those as little mini hubs from which to serve the poor, unfortunate businesses and homes that don't have a good connection. Traditionally, telephone exchanges and cabinets have done this in the past, but the technology that's been used to carry broadband over telephone lines has not been a very good solution for everyone, particularly as we get to less dense areas such as rural areas. But even places like Westminster in London suffered from the fact that their telephone systems were rolled out a long time ago with lines stretching to people's individual premises, and they're just a bit too long and it's a bit too expensive to dig up the streets as well. So there are some challenges with using some of that old infrastructure. But with fiber, if you can get fiber to the premises, you can definitely get the gigabit performance and plenty of scope for upgrading. So it's definitely an ambition. It's definitely something you want on your roadmap, but don't give up if it's not there today and if you can't see it in the near future. This is really, of course, where wireless comes in that we have a range of wireless platforms available which give us flexibility. We can deploy users in all sorts of locations, whether Welsh valleys, Welsh towns. If we're thinking about satellite, for example, there's very good availability geographically across the country. The snag with satellite is because particularly if we're looking at geostationary orbit, which is 20,000 miles above the Earth, the time taken by the signal to get up and back introduces unhelpful delays or latency in the services we're trying to interact with. Now, terrestrial wireless is much more desirable. We can deliver high performance. We can get gigabits per second. It can also be rapid to deploy. And if a premise then gets fiber, for example, we can redeploy that terrestrial wireless equipment somewhere else. But in deploying wireless, which is a great way to fill the gap with fiber, we do need to think about planning that network to ensure performance and reliability. We need to look at the sites where we're going to have the equipment and the antennas. We also need to think about spectrum access to make sure there's enough capacity in the locations where we need to use it. And we will think about, or need to think about, upgrades. For example, maybe 3-5 years' time, if the user's demand is still growing rapidly, as it may well, we need to get faster. So actually on the right was some results of studies from BT on the effects of different types of spectrum. So this is on the spectrum access point. If we use the highest spectrum at 5 gigahertz, which is in the latest Wi-Fi systems, this actually shows what the impact of 20% penetration of that service, of a Wi-Fi 5 gigahertz service, 20% of homes in a given area of London, how much coverage you'd get outside. And you can see there's a lot of white, which means it doesn't go that far. And you'll experience that within your own homes and offices, that 5 gigahertz really doesn't stretch. 2.4 gigahertz, the original Wi-Fi frequency, on the lower picture is much better. And with the technology that we trialed back a number of years ago, and which is now legal to deploy in the UK, the TV white spaces, we're a much lower frequency. And you can see the effects of using that spectrum with the same percentage of homes deploying the technology, how much greater coverage we can achieve. So this is just to illustrate the importance of spectrum and choice of spectrum in the wireless technologies. Now, connectivity literacy begins at home. We've talked about the wide area systems, but really you need, if you've got a home and an office, and hopefully you've got at least one of those, then you need to be thinking about how to get the best connectivity from whatever your service provider can deliver. And you need to think again about the types of services, whether it's video streaming. YouTube and Netflix are nominated the worst offenders in terms of demands on the broadband connection. Video conferencing, like our friendly face Zoom, and things like our cameras, front door cameras in our doorbells, CCTV applications, and other things can drive high performance requirements from our connection. We need appropriate use of wireless and wired connectivity. So it may be that if we can deploy wired connectivity between our rooms, that's going to give us the best combinations of security, reliability, and so on. But it may simply not be possible in an older building. We can't afford to perhaps go drilling everywhere, pulling up floorboards. Cost and convenience can come into the picture. And if we are deploying wireless, we need to think about where it's going to cover in our premises and possible interference from neighbors. So there are a number of things to think about, but if you haven't got your connectivity at your home or office correct, then that's where your problems start. Now, aside from the hard facts of connectivity, the wires and the wireless connections, there's a very important element which I've called soft connectivity, and that's really enabling you to get the most out of whatever digital connectivity you've got within your community. So it's making sure that the residents and businesses are really digitally ready and laying the foundations in terms of skills and awareness of what's actually available online. There are many, perhaps in the older members of the community, who are not as fully versed with how to use broadband or even why they should use it. So there's a need to lay those foundations and bring everyone into the benefits, particularly as we've seen what COVID has done in terms of closing the physical access to services. We need to map the vulnerabilities to see who's being left out without the means to join the smart community online and take appropriate action. If there are people who perhaps have surplus devices, perhaps can enable that connectivity by one means or another. And if we've got an area with very good mobile coverage, there are MiFi devices which can be provided to people who lack a fixed broadband connection for whatever reason. Now, to promote the soft connectivity, soft infrastructure, we've developed a model which we call the digital blacksmith. And the aim is to boost local digital skills and resources by coordinating with skills providers, libraries, schools, colleges, etc., and bringing those together with businesses and using the services for businesses to help fund some of those outreaches, digital champions, and things that would not necessarily be self-funding. And use that as an opportunity to invest in the local community, bring people together, and particularly post-COVID, help everyone recover as quickly as possible. Now, we've been delighted to pilot this on the Isle of Arran with myself directly and with a colleague that I worked with at Strathclyde University, who's based in Orkney, who's been doing great work again with this concept. So I'm sorry. Some of the things we've done with the digital blacksmith are such as running internet safety workshops at school, helping to signpost to local youngsters what sort of careers opportunities digital open up for them. And when the teenager puts her hand up and says, I want to do hairdressing, as if that's the end of the conversation, suddenly you're into, well, supposing your customers have an app and are able to choose what hairstyle they want, and supposing your competitor doesn't, where does that leave you? What advantage does that give you? So opening people's horizons. There's obviously a need to help people connect in those interior spaces we talked about. Web and social media applications are very important for businesses and other social organizations. And there's the whole field of Internet of Things applications. How can the farmer get started with the smart agricultural tools that will help them manage the land better and produce food more sustainably for everyone? Partnership is a smart essential. I would say maintaining a smart town platform requires interworking at all levels, including on the connectivity, a spirit where you're encouraging open innovation, sharing, and facilitating cooperation, for example, with the local authority and working also with industry and residents. And I have the picture of Cambridge because that's where I led something called the Cambridge White Spaces Trial, which was a landmark trial for this technology in the UK and Europe, and helped establish the regulations that we now have in place since 2016. So I can definitely underline the importance of cooperation and partnership, although it's not always an easy thing to do. And for example, in data sharing, it can be notoriously difficult to get even parts of the same council sharing data with each other, let alone with external organizations. And similarly with infrastructure, a need to perhaps share sites, allow access to your site for infrastructure that's going to benefit connectivity for other parts of your community. So to summarize, as I think I'm pretty well close to my limit if I haven't run over slightly, we don't actually need to wait for gigabit connectivity. And I have to say that that's where we should be aiming. But we can use a combination of optical and wireless technologies to help us get there more rapidly and effectively using wireless to close the gap to wherever fiber is. Spectrum is a key enabling resource with license exempt technologies such as Wi-Fi, allowing communities and enterprises, businesses to take coverage into their own hands and fill gaps themselves. Partnership is essential, and sharing connectivity skills and other enabling resources will enable the whole community to benefit. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and apologize to the organizer if I've run on a bit too much there.
Instantly forgiven. Thank you very much, Andrew. That was brilliant. Can I just ask one question? Because I was interested in the digital blacksmith model many years back.
Yes.
Do you think, or do you see that could evolve to be relevant to a smart town, whereby residents can take some ownership, play around with sensors, etc.?
It's about the community, really, isn't it? And I think communities can be different scales. Towns can definitely have a strong sense of community and identity. And to the extent that they're willing to work together, be open and share, then yes, the hub model works very well. I think actually 100% digital leads was an example of a sort of very much scaled up effort, which I think really covers all of the things that you really would like to see in that model. Fortunately, they've obviously got a very benign and enlightened council that's willing to fund that, which is great. But it does, yes, absolutely applicable to towns. And the reason for the blacksmith was to try and make it a little bit more approachable for older people who might recall older analogies of technology hubs.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew.